Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Ask everybody to stand for the pledge to the flag, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. During the public hearing part of this meeting, if anybody would like to speak, there's cards out on the main desk, and you can fill that out and present it to the desk, and then we'll call you in the order that they're presented. Roll call, we have a quorum. Approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. First will be the approval of the minutes of the February 17th, 2022 meeting.
I make a motion to approve the minutes from February 17th.
Thank you.
Second.
Second. All in favor? Okay, and then approval for the minutes of the meeting on April 21st, 2022.
Motion to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor? Great. Any items from board members? Okay. Any items from staff? Okay, thank you. Public hearing. Tonight we have one item on the agenda, V2219, 640 Brookford Drive, consideration of a variance to section 3.4 floodplain in order to allow an existing foundation to remain at its current elevation, constructed in 1983, at 8 inches above the floodplain, as well as a proposed deck addition within the floodplain. The property is located at 640 Brookford Drive and is legally described as being located in land lot 1126, 2nd District, 2nd Section, Fulton County, Georgia. That's good.
There we go. Chairman and board members, as stated, there's one item tonight, and I'll show you the map of the location. Property is shown here, red hatched. It's actually in Oakmere, which is off of Hopewell Road, or some know it as Canton. The property has existed since the 80s. I think in parts of my report I put the 70s, but the owner has confirmed, who has lived there since then, it is the 80s that it was actually built originally. And the applicant is requesting consideration of a variance as stated to Article 3, Section 3.4.5b, in order to allow an existing basement to remain at its current elevation, which is 8 inches above the floodplain. And there's another point that I'll talk about in the report where I say it's located within the floodplain, but I'll show you a map. It's adjacent to the floodplain. But our code does require that if you're within 200 feet of the floodplain, you still have to meet these regulations. So the property, 0.63 acres, zoned R15, developed with a 2-story, 2,000 square foot, single family detached home. The structure burnt, and I think you can, it's a little bit dark, but this is actually the side of the previous home. There's the garage. You can kind of see the opening here. We took the picture from the side because you could see kind of where the fire damage was at that time. So the applicant came in after the fire and obtained a building permit from the city. And at that time, he was just building on the current foundation. And our code didn't require that you submit the survey as part of that, since it's being built back on the existing foundation. The owner built the home to the permit that was given, and it was just a couple of months ago that he came in and said, well, I'd like to extend and add a deck. There was an existing deck, but he wanted a larger deck. In order to go outside of that footprint, that is when the survey was required. When the survey came back, that's when we realized this is within 200 feet of the floodplain. And at one corner, and I'll show you, this is probably a good plan to show the floodplain. So this part that I hatched here, the yellow, that is the current floodplain. Of course, when he built in the 80s, that floodplain did not encroach that much onto the property. Doesn't show on his 1993 surveys. That's just not information that he had. In fact, when we had the meeting with him a couple months ago, he was very surprised to learn of the new regulations that say if you're within 200 feet of a floodplain, then you have to be 3 feet above floodplain. What we did find is that it is 8 inches above the floodplain, so although they're not at the 3 feet, they are 8 inches. He hasn't experienced any flooding in the past. He has stated that now that he knows this, he'll probably be seeking flood insurance, which is not something he looked into in the past. When we went through our code, we found that there's 3 different reasons to give a variance to the floodplain, and they are not very detailed. So I'm going to tell you what those are, and that we did some research because they were so, I mean, anybody could ask for a variance if you went by what's in our current code. So section 3.4.6 says procedures for giving a variance, and it says number 1, within the floodplain, a finding of good and sufficient cause. Well, you can make a lot of presentations that could be good and sufficient cause. So what we did in order to make sure that our recommendation is something that would be specific for this particular application and not something that would set precedent, is we looked at ways that this lot was different from something we may see elsewhere in Alpharetta. Well, number 1, of course, we don't see many houses that are burned where you build back on the existing foundation, and then it would have to be perfect storm of being in a floodplain and burning, all of that. But when we looked at the regulations, it gave us guidance that we need to look at the actual topography of the lot. So that's what I'm presenting to you as to reasons that we think that that the variance should be given because of the existing topo and the lot configuration. What we found in looking at the floodplain is here. This line that I have across the front is actually their 150-foot buffer. So although the state requires a 25-foot buffer from the streams at the back of the property and the side, the city's own code requires a 150-foot buffer. So his entire property is within that 150-foot non-impervious buffer, which means you couldn't build a house today unless you received a variance to build to remove this vegetation. So when we looked at that, of course, you have a 150-foot buffer in Alpharetta because we believe that the trees and the impacts to the stream, we're trying to reduce those. So we don't want construction within the 150-foot buffer. If he was did not receive a variance and required to rebuild the house, basically remove existing foundation, meet the 3 feet, or move the house, closer to the road in order to get out of that, there would be substantial clearing of the existing trees, and I'll show you what that lot looks like. So this is today. This is with the house constructed back on that foundation, and because it was constructed back on the foundation, all the existing mature trees were able to remain that are within that buffer, and I'll show you kind of around that house. In order to remove this house, redo the foundation, this, of course, there'd be a lot of disturbance to the existing tree coverage. Here's the side of that with the trees. And this is a good shot that shows kind of the vegetation, the mature trees that are all around this property. We also looked at number 2, a determination that failure to grant the variance would result in exceptional hardship. And again, we just use that it's heavily wooded, that it maintains that 150-foot buffer, which is also something important to reduce flooding and additional water that is being absorbed by trees Removal of that, of course, could cause additional runoff. And then the last one, a determination that the granting of the variance will not result in increased flood heights, additional threats to public safety, extraordinary expense, or the creation of a nuisance. And I put the home has existed since the 1970s. That's incorrect. It's the early 80s. He hasn't experienced flooding. And of course, allowing a variance where it's just the existing foundation to remain without additional encroachment into the floodplain does not impact or cause a threat to the public safety or create a nuisance. After reviewing the application and these facts, we are supporting the request for the variance for the existing foundation to remain at its current location, which is 8 inches above the floodplain. And again, he is adjacent to the floodplain within 200 feet, which is why the requirement for the 3 feet. And the reasons are due to the shape and topography of the lot, as well as the impacts to the lot and the tree coverage if the variance were denied. The applicant did notify adjacent property owners and also did not receive any comments. We are recommending approval, subject to 2 conditions. 1, there shall be no expansion of the existing footprint. And 2, decks, porches, et cetera, must comply with floodplain regulations and must obtain necessary permits. And the reason we put number 2 here is when Mr. McGinnis did come in and ask for an expansion of the deck, you can do that as long as it's cantilevered. You know, a lot of times you put the posts back so that they're they meet the 8 inches above the floodplain if he's approved for the variance. And then you can cantilever so you can have more of a deck. The other regulations where you can build a deck within the floodplain are if it's built separately from the house, which means it's not attached to the house, but you have a couple of inches so you can still step out from the home. And the reason for that regulation is that that deck would remain separate, so if flood carried it off, it doesn't carry the house off, it just takes that deck. So there are ways to permit what he's requesting. It's just you have to go through that process. And that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer those.
Thank you. Any questions from staff?
I just have one question. Did you look at what the floodplain maps were in 1980 when it was originally built?
We did, and the regulations changed since then. Yeah, and we actually went through the history. That's a good question. We didn't even have the requirement for within 200 feet until 2014.
Right, I knew that was a change, so
Yeah, so
that coupled with the change
So
in the flood maps.
yeah. So if it wasn't for the 214, so this shows the corner of his house, and the orange is the floodplain. So it's right at that corner, so he's adjacent. And you know, with floodplain maps, they draw it. It's can go in and out. It could be as far back as here, you know, and farther encroaching here. So it was just in 2014 with the addition of within 200 feet of the floodplain. Even if you're not in the floodplain, you have to be 3 feet above.
Any other questions?
I have one. So
Here's
is this a
another one.
buildable, if this were a vacant lot, is this a buildable lot?
So it had a house on it that burned. And the owner has lived in it since it was built in the 80s. And this was the house that you could see the burn that was above the garage. So it was given a permit in the early 80s. The home was built and it just burned in 2021. So when the owner came in to get the permit, it built it back on that foundation.
But if he were permitting for a new construction home, if there wasn't an existing home, could he get a permit to build?
He would have to get a variance from the 150-foot setback of the stream buffer. He wouldn't need a variance from the 25-foot requirement that's required from the state, and he would still meet that. It's just that Alpharetta, so here's the stream, here's the floodplain and the structure. So although he's outside of that floodplain, he's within the 200 feet. So he would need a variance in order to, if this was a brand-new home didn't have a home there, he would need a variance. He would still meet the 25-foot buffer that the state requires. Those can be very difficult to get a variance from, but he would not meet the 150-foot city one.
Okay, thank you.
So this variance has to do with, it doesn't have necessarily to do with the deck then, correct? Like that's just
No.
what flagged it? It's the other, even though it was existing?
Right, and so when he came in with the deck, that's when we said, well, if you're going outside of that footprint, we need a survey, because we check setbacks, buffers, all of that. And that's when we discovered, well, he's within 200 feet of the floodplain. And since then, of course, we've put, even if your house has burnt, and you're going to build back on the same foundation, we've got to get a survey, because we don't want that to happen again. It's just that it doesn't happen very often, so it's something that we didn't catch until he came in with the deck request.
So it's really just the slope of his lot is the reason,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's our recommendation, because we're going to look at, like I said, the regulations for granting a variance for this section are so open. I mean, number one, a finding of good and sufficient cause. So we are going to look at, we've never had to use this section before, so we are going to look at increasing what good and sufficient cause is. It's just right now we don't have anything. So in order to do our research, we went to the federal floodplain regulations and went through their guidance, which is it should be based on the topography, additional impacts to the lot, not a hardship that it would cost somebody money to tear it down and rebuild, but basically the impacts to the environment.
He would still need a variance if he was going to tear down and rebuild, is what your point was, right?
Yes,
Yeah, so,
yes,
Yeah. And is it,
It's true.
is it an insurable property? Or is it now requiring flood insurance based on the fact that the map has changed?
I don't know. I think, and you may know more than I do about, we don't get into that with the individual property owners, and it's not for sale. I'm sure that was be something that would be disclosed for sale, but he can probably answer that as part of his part. I think now he's looking into that.
Yeah. Well, we had a property that was near the coast, and we weren't in a floodplain. And then with the floods back 10-plus years ago, we ended up in the floodplain, and our
Similar.
insurance notified us, and we were required to get flood insurance. I just wondered if that was a similar case here.
I don't think he was notified, but I'll let him answer that.
Yeah, that'll be outside the scope of this for this evening. Any other questions? Board? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. McGinnis, would you like to?
I'll leave this up in case.
Okay.
Good evening.
I'm Jimmy Dwayne McGinnis. Everybody knows me by my middle name, Dwayne. So I do reside at 640 Brookford Drive, even today. You saw the camper in the driveway. We're actually still living on the property, during the rebuild of this whole thing. I promise you, I didn't ask anybody to burn my house down and create this issue. But I really appreciate you guys taking this up and, trying to create some kind of a solution to this whole problem. So, as she said, where she got the 70s maybe showing up on the property, because I actually bought the lot in about 76, I think, somewhere there in that area before, when they were developing that whole Northtown area. When they first paved the streets, I bought that lot, and then actually built on it in 82 and 83. So we have no intentions of expanding, the footprint of the house. If I'd have known what we know now, I wouldn't ought to have tried to put that extra 12 feet of deck on either. So, which created this whole scenario that brought it up. So, but I think there's a solution to that too, that I think we're going to get worked out and be able to handle that part of it as well. So, at that point, I'd glad to answer any questions. In terms of your question about flood insurance, I did make an inquiry to 2 or 3 different brokers about flood insurance, and sent them the elevation certificate that we had done, you know, the request to see what this whole situation was. I am not required to have flood insurance, but there's an option for me to buy it if I want to. You know, I was given several different scenarios to do that with, and it's not very expensive to do it. It's nothing like what it would be if I had been in the floodplain, because as far as they're concerned, as long as you're not in the floodplain, you're not required. And I had refinanced the house over the years several different times. And the last time I remember this issue coming up was back in the 90s. The mortgage lender did require me to, you know, to research and find out where the floodplain was before we did it. And of course, at that time, the floodplain was back considerably further back than it's showing up today. So.
Great. Any questions?
Well, I appreciate the consideration for this.
Yeah, sorry you had to go through the fire.
Yeah, well, it's been an experience. I promise you this, the way things have been with materials and workers and everything else, this has been a hard road, so.
I can't imagine.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Any motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the variance with staff conditions.
Thank you.
A second.
Second, all in favor? Motion's approved. Thank you, sir. Okay, our next meeting will be on July 21st at 5:30. We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Yep.
Always outside this.
You have the real estate curiosity.